At September 17th, 1944, 0622, Arnhem, the Netherlands. The bridge is already on fire. Smoke rolls black across the Rhine. Metal screams somewhere below, and from the eastern tree line the sound every soldier dreads most, at dawn the low, grinding moan of German armor moving through the dark. 11 men. 130 caliber machine gun, a Piat anti-tank launcher with 4 remaining rounds, and coming straight at them the better part of an SS Panzer division. They knew the reinforcements weren't coming. They knew it hours ago. So why didn't they run? The Arnhem road bridge was, in the autumn of 1944, the most important piece of concrete in Western Europe. Operation Market Garden, the largest airborne assault in history, had one singular goal: seize a chain of bridges across Holland and thrust a corridor through Nazi-occupied territory into Germany itself. If the Allies could hold the bridge at Arnhem, the final bridge in the chain, the war could be over before Christmas. That was the theory. That was the promise made to men who jumped out of aircraft with nothing but rifles and hope. The men of the 2nd Battalion, 1st Parachute Brigade, British 1st Airborne Division, had taken their end of the bridge on the night of September 17th. Lieutenant Colonel John Frost, a lean, pipe-smoking officer who moved through artillery fire with the calm detachment of a man checking his mail, had led roughly 700 men in a night march through Arnhem's back streets, slipping past German patrols, and seized the northern approach to the bridge just after midnight. But by the morning of the 18th, the situation had already begun to unravel. The drop zones had been too far from the bridge, a decision made by Allied planners who feared flak from a nearby airfield. By the time the paratroopers had marched to Arnhem, the Germans, alerted by captured operational documents, had flooded the city with infantry. The other battalions attempting to reinforce Frost were stopped cold in the western suburbs, pinned down in street fighting that would grind on for days. Radio communications were nearly useless. The sets issued to the airborne units operated on frequencies that bounced unpredictably off the urban terrain. Frost and his men were alone. They held a cluster of buildings at the northern end of the bridge, a school, a warehouse, a row of Dutch townhouses, a perimeter perhaps 200 meters wide. They had dug in, stacked furniture against windows, punched loopholes through brick walls with bayonets and rifle butts. They had medical supplies for perhaps 48 hours. Ammunition for perhaps less. A soldier named Private Thomas watched from a second-floor window as the first German half-track crossed the bridge from the south. Probing, the Piat round blew it sideways off the road. The Germans pulled back, and for a few hours there was an eerie, fragile silence. That silence was a lie, because to the east, less than 3 kilometers away, the 9th SS Panzer Division Hohenstaufen had received its orders. They were not orders to probe. They were not orders to surround and wait. They were orders to retake the bridge. Immediately, with overwhelming force. The men in the buildings didn't know the exact numbers yet, but they could hear the engines. Everyone could hear the engines. A sound like distant thunder that didn't stop and didn't move. A sound that just kept getting closer. Sergeant Doyle, a tough Scotsman from Inverness who had jumped into Sicily the previous year, pressed his ear to the cold brick wall and listened for a long moment. "That's a lot of tanks," he said to no one in particular. Nobody disagreed. The first proper assault came at 09:15 am. German infantry SS Grenadiers in field gray, moving with the practiced efficiency of men who had fought on the Eastern Front, came down the bridge approach road in a rush, using the burning wreckage of the half-track as cover. They expected to find a thin screen of exhausted paratroopers, half asleep, low on ammunition, ready to crack at the first serious pressure. What they found instead was a wall of fire. The 30 caliber machine gun, positioned in the upper window of the warehouse facing the bridge, opened up at 200 yards and didn't stop. The gunner, a young corporal named Walsh, who had never been in combat before Market Garden, held his nerve and walked the gun across the advancing line with a thoroughness that stopped the assault cold. Men fell into the street. The rest broke for cover. Frost watched from the schoolhouse rooftop, binoculars up, counting, not enough dead. Far too many still moving. The Germans pulled back to reassemble. They would come again. They always came again. What Frost couldn't see from the rooftop was what was happening on the flanks. While the bridge assault had drawn every eye forward, a platoon of SS infantry had pushed through the narrow alleyways to the west, moving building to building, trying to find the edge of the British perimeter. Private Peters, covering a side street from a ground floor window, heard them before he saw them boot scrapes on cobblestone, the clank of equipment, hushed German voices 2 houses down. He had 12 rounds left in his Sten gun. He used 4 of them, fired them through the window blind without looking, then pressed himself flat against the wall as the return fire turned the plaster above his head to powder. When he looked again, the alley was empty, except for one man lying still in the shadows. The Germans had found the flank. They would exploit it. By noon, the radio crackled to life for the first time in 6 hours. The news was delivered in the clipped, restrained language of British military communications, which somehow made it worse. The 3rd Battalion had been stopped at a place called Den Brink. The 1st Battalion was pinned down in the Arnhem suburb of Oosterbeek. No relief column was getting through. XXX Corps, the armored relief force that was supposed to drive up from the south, was still fighting its way through Nijmegen, 40 miles away. Frost received this information, set the radio handset down carefully, and lit his pipe. He did not tell the men everything. Not yet. Clock reference #113 Clo hours, September 18th. 33 hours since the bridge was seized, at least 60 hours until any realistic chance of relief. Ammunition already at 60% of the original load. The math was not good. What made the afternoon worse was the mortar fire. The Germans had set up an 81 mise-a-mise mortar position in the park behind the eastern houses, invisible from any British firing position, and they began working it across the perimeter with methodical precision. The first rounds fell short craters in the cobblestones, shrapnel pinging off brick. The second series walked straight through the perimeter, detonating on rooftops, blowing chimney stacks apart, sending rubble cascading into the rooms below. The medical post, a room in the ground floor of the school, took a near miss that brought the ceiling down on 3 wounded men. Corporal Reese, the section medic, dug 2 of them out with his bare hands. The third man, a lance corporal named Gibbs, who had been shot through the thigh that morning, did not survive. The loss hit the men harder than they expected, not because Gibbs was especially beloved though he was, but because it punctured something invisible, the belief that the wounded were safe, that there was a floor beneath the danger. There was no floor. Private Peters was moved to the upper floor to replace a lookout who had taken shrapnel in the shoulder. From the new position, he could see across the rooftops to the eastern edge of the city, and what he saw pulled the breath out of him. German vehicles, dozens of them, not just half-tracks and armored cars, actual tanks. Panzer forts, their long guns traversed toward the bridge perimeter, picking their angles, moving up through the streets with the unhurried confidence of men who knew exactly where their enemy was and had all the time in the world. He called it down to Frost on the ground floor. Frost came up, looked through his binoculars for a long time, and said nothing. Then He went back downstairs and began repositioning the Piat team. By 16:00, the fuel dump in the warehouse had been hit by incendiary fire. The building was burning. The men inside had approximately 4 minutes to grab everything they could carry and fall back to the schoolhouse before the whole structure was consumed. They came out through the smoke, half-blinded, arms full of ammunition boxes and radio equipment, and the Germans opened up from the rooftops across the street. 2 more men went down in the crossing. The perimeter was shrinking. The first climax came at dusk, when a German armored car pushed directly to the bridgehead, less than 50 meters from the school, and its commander stood in the open hatch and called out in accented English, his voice carrying clearly through the smoke-filled street, that the position was surrounded, that resistance was futile, that the German commander offered terms of honorable surrender. The answer from the schoolhouse second floor was immediate. A burst of Bren gunfire that sent the armored car reversing at speed, its commander ducking below the hatch rim. The car clipped a lamppost on the retreat, and its exhaust pipe dragged sparks across the cobblestones as it disappeared into the darkness. A ragged cheer went up from the men in the windows. It was the first sound of genuine joy in 15 hours. But everyone knew, Frost knew, Doyle knew, Peters knew, that the armored car would be back, and the next time, it wouldn't be alone. The night of September 18th to 19th was the worst night any of them had ever lived through. The Germans had learned their lesson about direct assault. Instead of pushing infantry up the road in the open, they sent them building by building, burning each house as they cleared it, tightening the ring of fire around the schoolhouse perimeter, house by house, hour by hour. By 0020 am, the men in the upper floors could see flames on 3 sides. The smoke was so thick that visibility inside the building had dropped to 4 or 5 meters. Men navigated by touch, one hand on the wall, coughing into their sleeves. Ammunition was now critical. Walsh, the machine gunner, had 47 rounds of 30 cal left. He had been keeping count obsessively, marking tally strokes on the plaster with his thumbnail. 47 rounds. At the rate they were being used, 3 to 5 round bursts, that was perhaps 10 more engagements. Perhaps fewer if the targets were moving fast. Doyle made a decision that saved the position. He pulled Walsh off the machine gun entirely. Not because Walsh was unreliable, he was extraordinary. But because Doyle understood something that comes only from years of combat experience, the machine gun was the Germans' primary target. Every assault, every mortar adjustment, every sniper shot was aimed at silencing it. As long as the gun fired, the Germans knew exactly where it was. If the gun went silent, they wouldn't know why. So Doyle had the weapon moved quietly, in the dark, by men crawling on their stomachs to the opposite corner of the building. Then he had 3 men near the old position throw bricks at regular intervals against the metal window shutter, a sound that, at distance, in darkness, through the fog of combat, could pass for a weapon being repositioned or cleared. The Germans adjusted their mortar fire toward the old position. The new position stayed cold and quiet. It wasn't much, but in a fight this small, on a timeline this tight, it was everything. Clock reference, #20330 am, September 19th. 51 hours at the bridge. No relief. Radio contact lost. Ammunition down to what could be counted on 2 hands. 14 men still capable of fighting from an original force that had been whittled down by casualties, by fatigue, by the accumulated violence of 2 full days. Private Peters had not slept in 40 hours. His hands shook when he reloaded, not from fear, precisely, but from the complete physical depletion that comes when the body has spent everything it had and is now running on nothing. He had taken a rifle from a dead German, a Karabiner 98K, with a full 5-round stripper clip, and he used it because he'd run out of Sten ammunition, and because the German rifle was accurate and he could see well enough from his window to use that accuracy. It was strange, he thought, using their weapon, firing German cartridges at German soldiers. He did not dwell on the strangeness long. There was no time to dwell. The second climax arrived at 04:45, and with the most terrifying sound of the entire siege, the close, gut-deep rumble of a tank engine, not on the bridge approach, not at distance, but in the narrow street directly behind the schoolhouse. A Panzer IV had found the alley. It was 40 meters away. Its gun was traversing toward the back wall. The Piat team, 2 men, Private Cassidy and a young Dutchman, turned volunteer named Van der Berg, who had attached himself to the battalion in Arnhem, had to crawl out the back window, across open ground, in darkness, within the field of view of the tank's hull gunner, and get close enough to use the weapon. The Piat had an effective range of about 100 meters against a stationary target. Against a tank in a narrow alley, 40 meters away, that was almost a point-blank shot. Almost, but the weapon's spring mechanism was difficult to cock after extended use, and the cold had made it worse. Cassidy had test-fired it twice against infantry positions during the day, and the second time the mechanism had jammed for 30 terrible seconds before releasing. If it jammed against the tank, they would both die. Doyle went instead of sending them alone. Against every principle of command, against everything that said the senior man stays back, he went, because he was the strongest and most experienced, and because if the Piat jammed, he was the one most likely to unjam it under pressure. They went out the window one at a time, low and fast, and the hull gunner never saw them in the dark and the smoke. Doyle was 15 meters from the tank when it fired. The shell hit the back wall of the schoolhouse and brought down 2 rooms. The building shuddered like a struck bell. Plaster dust filled the air, and men stumbled and fell in the dark, and someone was screaming not in pain, but the involuntary animal scream that the body produces when its world is suddenly turned upside down. Doyle stood up from where the blast had thrown him. He cocked the Piat. It caught. First try. He put the round through the Panzer's engine deck from 12 meters. The tank did not explode immediately. It isn't like the films. It caught fire slowly, oil burning, ammunition cooking off in a series of smaller detonations that lit the alley like a strobe. The crew scrambled out through the commander's hatch and ran, and nobody in the building had enough ammunition to pursue them. Doyle came back inside, covered in soot, one ear bleeding, his hands shaking so badly he had to put them flat on a table to make them stop. "Piat works," he said. He had 1 round left. In the German command post 3 blocks away, Hauptsturmführer Klaus Becker, commanding the armored assault element, stood before a map table and tried to explain to his superior what was happening. He couldn't explain it. He had used everything. Infantry in the streets, artillery adjustment, mortar barrage, direct armor, a panzer, had been lost to what appeared to be a single anti-tank weapon in the hands of 2 men in an alley. His casualty count at the bridge approach alone was over 80. His men were not cowards. His men were Waffen-SS, veterans of the Eastern Front, soldiers who had held positions against Soviet armor, and 11, perhaps 12 British paratroopers in a burning school were still holding the north end of the bridge. He reached for the field telephone. The report he dictated upward was honest, and it was unusual. "The British at the bridge," he said slowly, "are not fighting according to any doctrine I recognize. They improvise. They deceive. They relocate faster than we can adjust fire. I have given them every reason to surrender, and they refuse. I do not know what is holding them together. I do not know what they believe is coming that is worth dying for. But whatever it is, I am beginning to believe it might be nothing. And they know it. And they are fighting anyway. There was a long pause on the other end of the telephone. Then, destroy the building, came the reply. Becker looked at the map. Yes, he said. I know. The truth, the thing the viewer has been circling since the opening, arrived not as a dramatic announcement, but as a quiet admission between two exhausted men in a burning building. Frost found Doyle sitting against the wall in what had been the medical room, which was now simply a room with a medical bag in the corner and several men lying on the floor. Dawn was beginning to gray the smoke outside the windows. The fires on three sides had burned low, replaced by the deeper, slower burn of structural timbers, a heat that radiated through the walls like a furnace. Doyle looked up. He read Frost's face. Frost's face was a soldier's face, controlled, composed, giving nothing away. But Doyle had been watching officers for 15 years. When did you know? Doyle asked. Frost sat down against the wall beside him. He didn't pretend not to understand the question. The evening of the 18th, Frost said. The radio contact with XXX Corp. They're still south of Nijmegen. The bridge there isn't fully clear. Even if they break through today, he paused. They won't be here before we run out. Doyle absorbed this. The men, he said. Don't know, Frost said. And they don't need to. Not yet. There was a long silence between them. Outside, somewhere to the east, a German mortar fired the hollow thump of the round leaving the tube, the brief silence, then the crash of impact, somewhere close. Dust filtered down from the ceiling. Why are we still here, then? Doyle asked, not as a challenge, as a genuine question. Frost looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then he said something that Doyle would remember for the rest of his long life, because every hour we hold this bridge is an hour the Germans can't use it. Every tank that's sitting in front of us is a tank that isn't at Nijmegen, isn't pushing XXX Corp back. We don't have to survive. We just have to cost them enough that the rest of the operation can survive without us. Doyle said nothing. Frost stood up, brushed plaster dust from his jacket, and went back to the command post. This was the twist. Not a hidden escape route. Not surprise reinforcements already en route. Not a tactical trick that would turn the tables. The twist was simpler and more brutal. These men had already calculated that they would likely die here. Had already accepted it, and had decided quietly, without ceremony, to die, making the calculation matter. They weren't waiting for reinforcements. They were the delay. They were the purpose. They were, in the cold arithmetic of Operation Market Garden's collapsing timeline, the living shield that bought time for 60,000 other men. Clock reference, #3080 AM, September 20th. 80 hours at the bridge. 7 men still on their feet, capable of firing. 4 men wounded badly enough to require support. 3 men dead. On the German side, the picture was becoming clearer and more embarrassing. Hauptsturmführer Becker received a visit from Obersturmbannführer Walter Harzer, the 9th SS Panzer Division commander, who had come forward to understand personally why a strategic bridge was being held by what his intelligence officers now estimated was a force of fewer than 15 British soldiers. Harzer walked through the German positions himself. He saw the burned-out half-track from the first day. He saw the Panzer IV still smoking in the alley. He counted the German dead near the bridge approach, the men who had gone forward in clean assault lines and met the machine gun in the window and never come back. He stood for a long time, looking at the school, its windows dark, its upper floor partly collapsed, smoke still rising from its walls. Then he said to Becker, quietly, "How many men have we committed against this position?" Becker told him. Harzer was silent. "And how many are in there?" Becker told him that too. Harzer's expression did not change, but something in his bearing shifted, a slight stiffening, a recognition that translated directly into a kind of unwilling respect that a professional soldier feels when he meets an opponent whose quality he has underestimated. "They haven't been holding the bridge," Harzer said finally. "They've been holding us." He looked at the bridge. Then back at the school. "Bring up the 88s, he said. "Finish it." The 88 BSME anti-tank guns arrived in the late morning of September 20th, and they changed everything. The Piat was useless against them at range. The machine gun was useless against their shield plates. The only option, the one Frost had been quietly working toward all morning while the men rested in shifts, was the deception. It was desperately thin. But it was all they had. Frost had 2 men make noise, deliberate, theatrical noise at the east wall, the sound of equipment moving, of heavy objects being dragged, voices calling out in low tones, not enough to pinpoint, but enough to suggest movement, preparation, the arrival of something. Meanwhile, the remaining fighting men repositioned to the north, facing windows and the roof access, silent as smoke, moving through the rubble in stockinged feet. The 88 crews nervous, uncertain what the noise meant, not wanting to walk into something they hadn't seen, delayed their approach. 12 minutes. 12 minutes in which nothing happened except 7 exhausted, half-broken soldiers moved themselves into new positions and checked their remaining ammunition one more time and looked at each other in the gray light and said nothing. And then the 88s opened up. The first round hit the east wall, the wall they had abandoned, and the concussion was so powerful that men 30 feet away were thrown off their feet. The second round hit the same wall. The third hit the roof. The school was coming apart, brick by brick, beam by beam, under the systematic work of guns designed to kill tanks. Walsh was firing the machine gun from the roof access, the last stand position, the one you went to when there was nowhere else to go. He was firing at the 88 crews directly, at 400 meters, a nearly impossible shot with the gun shaking from nearby impacts. He didn't hit anyone. He didn't need to. He needed to make them flinch, slow them down, give the Piat one last chance. Doyle took it. 1 round left in the Piat. He went to the top floor window. The building was so damaged by now that what had been a wall was mostly open to the sky, and he waited. The lead 88 rolled forward on its half-track carrier to get a better angle on the school's remaining north corner. It stopped. The crew began to traverse the gun. Doyle fired. The round struck the half-track's track assembly. Not the gun, the track. The vehicle slewed sideways, immobilized, blocking the road and stalling the advance of the second 88 behind it. The gun crew scrambled free. The machine was dead. The gun was intact. They had maybe 15 minutes before the Germans got it operational again. Frost was on the ground floor, beside a window that had no glass left in it, a Sten gun in his hands, when he heard it. At first he thought it was another tank. The engine note was wrong for that, too high, too varied, not the diesel growl of the Panzers. He stood up and looked north, through the broken window frame, into the thin September morning. Vehicles on the northern approach road, the wrong direction. He grabbed his binoculars. American markings. Clock reference 4:11:40 am, September 20th. What had happened, what Frost could not have known from inside his burning fortress, was that the Polish 1st Independent Parachute Brigade had dropped south of the river the previous day, and a small American detachment attached to XXX Corps forward elements had found a secondary route north through the Dutch farmland, across a smaller canal bridge that the Germans hadn't fully secured, and pushed hard through the night on the strength of an intelligence report that said Frost's men were still alive and still fighting. They weren't the main relief force. There were 47 of them, barely enough to tip the balance, let alone relieve the position properly. Their commander, a young American captain named Reeves, had been told explicitly by his battalion commander that the Arnhem Bridge was not an American objective, and that taking his men there was outside his authorization. He went anyway, because 47 men against a depleted German assault force, arriving from the unexpected direction, with the element of surprise, at the moment the Germans were already off balance from the destroyed half-track, it was enough. The Germans, who had been on the edge of a final breakthrough, suddenly found themselves taking fire from behind. Their assault on the school hesitated, then stopped, then reversed. The 88 crews abandoned the immobilized half-track. The infantry, who had been massing for what they expected to be a final clearance operation, fell back to assess the new threat. In that reversal, in that 20-minute window of German confusion and tactical repositioning, Frost got his men out. Not cleanly. Not all of them. 3 men were too badly wounded to move, and were left in the care of a German medical officer who, to his credit, honored the obligation. The others, 7 men walking, 4 men half-carried, moved north through the smoke, through a city that was still very much a battlefield, guided by Reeves and his Americans, who knew a route along the river embankment that was momentarily clear. They crossed out of the German lines at 12:15 p.m. The school burned behind them. In the days that followed, Operation Market Garden collapsed. The bridge at Arnhem was not held. The war did not end before Christmas. The broader strategic gamble failed, and the cost was enormous, over 17,000 Allied casualties across the entire operation. History recorded this. History acknowledged the failure. But history also recorded something else. The German 9th SS Panzer Division, a formation that had faced Soviet armor on the Eastern Front, that had cracked Russian lines from Kharkov to the Dnieper, had committed hundreds of soldiers and multiple armored vehicles against fewer than 15 British paratroopers, and had taken 86 casualties in 2.5 days at the bridge approach alone. In his post-war memoir, Walter Harzer wrote about the men in the school with a directness that military commanders rarely permit themselves. He wrote that he had underestimated not their numbers, he'd always known they were few, but their understanding of what they were doing. They knew, he wrote, that they could not win. They fought anyway. I have spent many years trying to understand the source of that quality. I have not found a better answer than this. They believed the cost of their dying mattered. And they were right. 80 hours and 11 minutes. That was how long they held the bridge. Long enough that the question asked at the beginning of this story can finally be answered, not with a tactical formula, not with a military doctrine, but with the simplest possible truth. They defended the bridge knowing reinforcements would never arrive, because they understood with the cold, complete clarity that only comes to men who have counted their ammunition and counted their enemies and done the math that the bridge was never the point. They were the point. The time they could buy. The cost they could impose. The message they could send to the Germans who faced them, to the men they protected without knowing their names, to whatever future looked back across the ruins of that burning Dutch city, that this ground, this moment, this cause was worth every last round. It always is.